Hello and welcome back to this video all about how to pick the right programming language for you. Now, to get started with this, I want to address some stuff that comes up pretty commonly when people are looking into different programming languages and trying to pick the right programming language, because a lot of people kind of go in a weird direction, and it's a logical way to go, but it doesn't lead to the results that people are looking for most of the time. Let's talk about what things actually don't matter that people are usually focused on when they're looking to pick a programming language. So to get started with this even, the number one thing people look for is the programming language that pays the most, that has the highest salary, that has the highest paying jobs, or whatever variation of that you might think of. And this seems like a great way to look, right? Like if I look at the one that pays the most and I learn that one, then I will make the most. That's the logical thought process. But the problem with this is that when it comes down to how much a developer earns, it's not actually about the programming language that they're using, and so it almost becomes completely irrelevant. What you usually will find is that it'll say something like Python developers get paid the most of the time anyway, because people who do machine learning, data science, and artificial intelligence happen to use Python. But if you learn Python and develop APIs, you're not going to make the same amount of money as those machine learning or data science developers do. So it's really misleading to say, oh, well, Python pays the most, I should learn Python, because you could learn Python and make less than most other developers if you're doing the wrong thing with it. So ultimately, the results when you look for kind of the highest paying or the highest salary programming languages are just misleading. And they lead you to believe that whatever result you find, you just have to learn that programming language and you'll be off to the races to make a bunch of money. But the things that cause those developers to earn more isn't actually about the language. Like I said, it's about the job that they're doing. So the highest paid developers are probably machine learning developers and DevOps developers. And machine learning developers and DevOps developers both usually touch Python at least. They might not focus on it, but both of them definitely use Python to some extent. So you're going to wind up seeing, oh, well, Python. But then there's also a lot of developers using Python for other things that are not earning as much money, using it for things like API development or web development, even mobile development or game development, which is a smaller niche, I would say. For mobile development and game development, I would probably never touch Python, but that's besides the point. What I'm trying to get at here is the programming language itself has very little to do with the salary that you'll earn. So if you look for the highest paying programming language, you're going to get nothing but misleading results. Now, the next thing most people seem to search for is the most popular programming languages. So they'll say, oh, well, if it's really popular, it'll be easy for me to find a job. And again, ironically enough, you'll probably find that Python is one of those most popular languages. But the thing about popularity is when you look at the most popular languages, the results that you come up with are usually about what developers think about those languages. So languages like Rust and Golang and all kinds of really fun, cutting-edge programming languages are going to come up on that list of the most popular programming languages. But then after you learn those programming languages, if you go look at jobs, you will see next to nothing actually pop up for those languages, because the most popular programming languages are usually the ones that are relatively new, relatively cutting edge. They're kind of fun to work with, but because they're so new, there are very few companies that are using them yet. And so because so few companies are using them, it doesn't matter how good you are at this super popular programming language, it's not actually popular among businesses. And so that's where popularity can also kind of be misleading. And at the end of the day, it just doesn't even help you to get a job to pick a popular programming language. And I would even say almost the opposite, where most popular programming languages don't actually have a lot of jobs. They're mostly new and uncommon. And so because of that, they are the least likely to actually get you a job. So unfortunately, if you've spent a bunch of time looking into the highest paying programming languages or the most popular programming languages or both to try and decide which language you want to use, you've probably wasted a little bit of time. But fortunately, you've stumbled upon this video, and here we're going to talk about what actually does matter and what actually is important when you're picking a programming language to help you figure out what you should actually do. And because of how nuanced this actually gets, the answer is actually going to be different from person to person. Now, I do have like a major suggestion and a way that I would probably do this if I was starting from the ground up, but that is to get into full stack web development, which isn't what everybody wants to do. So ultimately, my top suggestion might not even fit every person's situation, which we are going to talk about. We're going to talk about more than just my top suggestion. We're going to talk about how you can decide, and then we're going to talk about what that suggestion would be or what else you could do if that's not the direction you want to go, if you don't want to be a full stack web developer, if you want to do something else with programming. So as I just mentioned about my top suggestion being geared towards web developers, the thing that actually does matter the most is what you want to do, what your actual end goal is. And you might just be thinking, well, I want to be a programmer, or I want to learn to program. And ultimately that's like one small piece that fits into a bunch of different puzzles. So you have to pick a specific or a more specific goal than that before you can actually learn to program, and you might not even know what you're picking between. So this should be, the most useful piece of this video and the most useful piece of information to have as you go through and decide where to start when you're learning to program. So ultimately, my top choice, again, is web development, even full stack web development, because web development can be broken up into multiple different pieces. And personally, I think the most valuable way to learn, especially as a self-taught developer, is to learn all the pieces so that you can build a full comprehensive solution on your own and show off your abilities, because that is the best way, in my opinion, to show that you've actually learned how to program well enough to be hireable and to find a job. Now, another popular choice is mobile development, which is development of like phone applications. And mobile development is very similar to web development in a lot of ways, and it even uses a lot of the same tools as web development most of the time, and increasingly so as tools come out to make even the front end of mobile development able to be created with web development tools like React and Angular. And I'm not going to get too specific about that, but I just want to mention that because even if you learn full stack web development and then decide later, hey, I want to get into mobile development, you probably have all or most of the tools that you need to make that shift, and you'll wind up using almost all of the same tools as you move into mobile development. Now, another popular one is video game development. Now, unfortunately, the problem with video game development, or the biggest problem with video game development, is the oversaturation. So there are so many people who want to be video game developers that learn the programming skills and even the modeling skills and all of the things they need to do to build video games that it's like a dime a dozen to find a video game developer. And as a result, video game developers don't generally make very much money unless they own their game. So a lot of indie game developers are actually earning more than people who are working on major projects, like people working on, something like Fortnite that everybody knows about. Those developers working on that are probably making less than someone who's working on like some crazy obscure thing you've never heard of, who gets to keep all the money they earn from building that game. So ultimately, video game development is a popular path. It might be really fun for you to do, and that might be great for you. But I want to, add the grain of salt here that most video game developers are just not earning as much as other developers are. And ultimately, too, there's not much overlap between the tools used for video game development and the tools used for other development. Now, the basic fundamentals of programming apply to just about every programming language, so those fundamentals are the same for video game developers. But where things get different is like the programming languages used, the tools used, the end result that you get, will generally be completely different than what you would do in any other language. Now, another popular one that most people don't even think about is actually database management and SQL. So database management, database development, database administration, all of the things that kind of go into storing data in a database and managing that data once it's there, which may sound like gibberish to you right now, but all of that stuff actually goes really deep and gets really complex. And there are a lot of jobs out there that you wouldn't even think to look at, that you wouldn't even think to look for, that are very focused on database management and on SQL development. And as another added bonus, SQL development goes into just about everything else. So SQL development is something that you need for video games, mobile development, and web development as well. And commonly, it is something useful for just about every form of programming that there is. And because SQL is such a foundational piece of so many different programming things, it's definitely somewhere that I would recommend most people start with, because you can't really go wrong with it. And knowing SQL first makes other programming and other development make a whole lot more sense, because all development kind of centers around something called a model or a group of models, and models have a group of fields, and those fields are defined in the SQL database. So the underlying structure that every other type of programming feeds off of basically comes from what was set up in SQL, or what is set up in SQL and in a database, because at the end of the day, most applications are all about sending and receiving data from a database and kind of storing information in a database and then retrieving it later. Like YouTube would be a really great example, because all the information about your profile on YouTube when you log in is stored in a database. All of the comments and who wrote them and when they wrote them is stored in a database, and all of those pieces of data are kind of organized in a uniform way that fits into a database table, and the database tables kind of define how everything else works. I definitely recommend learning about it for just about everyone who's getting into programming and development. Now, another completely different kind of segment of programming is networking, and networking is all about like setting up like internet connections to like stuff like computers and printers and talking over the internet, and even more recently, or more modernly, you could say, it also kind of involves DevOps, which is like cloud development, dealing with different stuff in the cloud. And there are multiple kind of major cloud providers at this point too. Now, most people know about AWS, which is Amazon's cloud service, but we also have Azure, which is Microsoft's cloud service. And there's also Google Cloud Platform, which is Google's cloud platform, of course. And honestly, right now, AWS and Azure are still a lot more popular than Google Cloud Platform, but Google Cloud Platform will be a heavy hitter for a long time, I would say, because they have that power behind them to keep growing. But ultimately, when you talk about networking and DevOps, it's not really even about a programming language as much as it is about the tools that you need to learn to work with. So it's all about understanding how networks work, different ports that you need to use for things, the way that firewalls work, the way that cloud tools work to integrate everything together. So for those two, I wouldn't even necessarily focus on a programming language at all, but on a specific tool set. Like I would pick a cloud platform to start with, and I would also focus on basic networking concepts that most DevOps and network developers need to know. Things like working with and setting up firewalls and ports and VPNs and connections between different devices. Now, another popular one that comes up a lot, even more so probably than database and SQL, is data science. Now, people are really interested in data science because it is a very high-paying field to get into, and it is very focused on kind of getting actionable insights out of data, especially big data, and there are a lot of data science jobs popping up. There's a really big need for data scientists. For the most part, most data scientists at this point still have a pretty powerful college education behind them to get them hired. but I think we are kind of slowly moving into a place where it's becoming less and less important for data scientists because there is just such a big and growing need for new data scientists. And on top of that, data science kind of logically leads into machine learning. Now, machine learning is what powers artificial intelligence, and machine learning and AI together are kind of becoming this bigger and bigger thing that so many people are very interested in figuring out what they can do with it, figuring out how they can use it. Now, a lot of people think of like ChatGPT when they think of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and that's not exactly the same thing. So ChatGPT is a large language model. So it is an artificial intelligence that knows how to talk, and that's basically its entire goal, being able to talk. And so that is really cool and really powerful, but artificial intelligence is just so much more than that. It's about like recognizing trends and being able to analyze information to draw conclusions on its own. And it's really difficult to kind of get into all of the things that machine learning is capable of, but it is just another really cool field to get into. And so data science and machine learning together, they are both very heavily focused in Python, but they are also both a higher barrier for entry. So it would be a lot easier to learn everything you need to learn to become a web developer on your own than it would to become a data scientist or a machine learning engineer on your own. Not to say that it's impossible, it can definitely be done, but it is a lot more difficult. There is a lot more to learn, and ultimately the Python part of it is not even the most important part by a landslide. The more important part about data science and machine learning is the math behind it all, the way that it works, and understanding why you would do certain things in a certain way so that you can kind of structure things to achieve the right result. So with all of that said, another really important thing to consider is job availability. So even if you kind of decide you wanted to do one of these specific things, there's usually more than one way to do them. And so to decide which way to do it, which thing to learn about is the better choice. So in the case of like DevOps and networking, deciding which cloud platform to go with, or in the case of web development and mobile development, which frameworks to learn about, it all comes down to job availability. So what you would want to do is kind of look at jobs in your area or in the area you want to look in, whether that is local to you or remote jobs. And once you have an idea of the jobs that are out there, you should pick skills that are relevant to those jobs. Like for me personally, and I think this is still true today for a lot of people, C# and .NET and Angular and MS SQL Server has been kind of a big powerhouse. Like there are a lot of jobs that use that tech stack and those technologies. And so having those skills specifically for me has been the most powerful choice. Now, before I learned about any of those things, I learned about Python thinking, Python is the highest paying programming language. And that was completely useless to me. Like I have used Python in my career a handful of times, but it has not been nearly as important for me as knowing about .NET and Angular. So I wish if I could go back and shake myself, I would tell myself, hey, why don't you go look at the jobs that are actually out there before you pick something to learn about, because I probably would have saved myself a ton of time. And finally, one other kind of more nuanced thing to think about is dynamic versus statically typed languages. Now, I'm only going to give a basic overview of what this means. So basically, dynamically typed languages don't define the type of each variable, whereas statically typed languages do define the type of each variable. So in a statically typed language, if I had some kind of number, I couldn't then change it to be like a sentence, you know what I mean, or a date. Whereas in a dynamically typed language, I could have one variable that used to be a date and now it's a sentence, and in a little while it could become a number, and that would be totally fine. Now, ultimately, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, well, dynamic sounds much better, much easier to work with, right? But a lot of developers, especially senior developers, would say that that is just not true, that static languages are actually better because with static languages, it's a lot easier to maintain your code. It's a lot easier to go into your code and understand what's happening and kind of make decisions about what to do next to change your code, to fix a bug, to make the code work in the way that it should. So ultimately, I would recommend starting with a static language so that you can at least understand those variable types, because even in the dynamic language, the variable types are still there and they still matter. They just can change, and they're not kind of like up in the front where you can see them. They're just kind of happening in the background. So it's even more important, in my opinion, to understand those data types when you're working with a dynamic language. And so having first worked with a static language can be really valuable. All right, so now that we've talked about the more complex concepts behind how we would pick what we would even want to do, let's talk about some slightly more specific programming languages and how they kind of fit into each of these categories. So let's start by just talking about SQL. Now, SQL, I think, is a great place to start for just about anybody. It is a building block that usually comes into play for almost every type of programming, but especially if you wanted to be a full stack web developer, which is kind of the path that I advocate for the most, then SQL is definitely the best place for you to start because everything else that you do is based around what's happening in the database. So with SQL, there are a couple of different database options. Now, I personally recommend MS SQL Server almost 100% of the time, just because it is a really powerful database solution. It's got a lot of really cool features to it that other database engines don't have, stuff like stored procedures, and the way that you can kind of check on query plans, the way that you can manage everything to kind of make sure that it's optimized is a lot more powerful in MS SQL Server. And as an added benefit, at the end of the day, if you wanted to be a SQL developer and really focus on just SQL, then MS SQL Server is one of the most popular database engines for database administrators to work with. Now, another popular option is PostgreSQL. So PostgreSQL is like kind of similar to MS SQL Server. It does a lot of the same things. Now, they don't have the same type of stored procedures, but beyond that, there are a lot of really cool tools that still work with PostgreSQL, and especially among application developers, web developers, and mobile app developers, PostgreSQL is still very popular. And that kind of leads into the next one, which is MySQL. Now, MySQL is right up there with PostgreSQL. I think Postgres has become slightly more popular than MySQL at this point, but both of these are kind of secondary options to MS SQL Server. They are relational databases. And then we also have like the new up and coming, or I guess it's not really that new anymore, but the idea of NoSQL. So MongoDB is a great choice for NoSQL just to get you kind of started, but ultimately NoSQL all kind of works in the same way. And for the most part, it's kind of just an unstructured version of SQL that is, in my personal opinion, less efficient and less easy to work with, but it is still very popular because it's a lot easier to get started with. So if you had learned about things in the other direction, if you had started with app development and you already had an app and you just wanted to connect it to something that can store your data, then connecting to a NoSQL engine is a lot easier because you can just kind of throw stuff in there. It doesn't matter what the structure is. But at the end of the day, once you have a bunch of data in there, it can be really difficult to work with that data because you just kind of threw it in there. So it's definitely a give and take. A lot of people love NoSQL, especially for the speed of development, because you don't have to do really any SQL work ahead of time. Now, there are times where you might want to, implicitly define the structure to make things easier to manage along the way. And in that way, you can almost develop your own database engine similar to MS SQL Server using your favorite programming language. So it can be really cool, it can be really powerful, and it can be really fast. But for the most part, especially for newer developers, it can be mishandled and it can become unmanageable over time. Now, after SQL, the next thing that you would probably want to learn about for web development would be backend API development, because the backend, the API, is what talks directly to the database to kind of interact with it and either send that information back to the front end or to update that information in the database. So the API is kind of like the middleman that connects the database to the front-end application. So with that in mind, there are a lot of different options for back-end API development, and this is definitely the number one piece that you would want to look up as far as jobs in your area. So when it comes to the backend, when it comes to the API, I should even say, it is very different from one job to another and from one area to another. Like in my area, for instance, C# and .NET are definitely the most popular choice for API development. Now, this is definitely a popular choice across the board, but in your area, there might be some other choices that are more popular. One very popular alternative is JavaScript with Node and Express, which is especially convenient because JavaScript is one of the languages you need to develop the front end of a web application. So you could stick to just one language, but with JavaScript and Node and Express, you can run into some issues that come with working with a dynamic language that you wouldn't get with other static languages like C#. And another popular choice is Java with Spring. So Java is a totally different programming language than JavaScript. So if you weren't aware of that, it's definitely worth noting that Java is like the complete opposite of JavaScript. So JavaScript is a scripted language, it's dynamic. Java is a compiled language and it's static. And so they're kind of like two complete opposites. JavaScript was actually named after Java to try and gain some popularity when it first came out, and ultimately it has led to a lot more confusion than anything else. And finally, another popular option might be Python, especially Python with Flask, or another popular one might be FastAPI, has been pretty popular lately, but these are kind of the main choices, but they aren't the only ones. So ultimately, I would look up full stack developer jobs or something along those lines and see which backend choice is being used. Because for the most part, the backend is what is kind of the most different, whereas in the front end, there are a couple of main frameworks that are all relatively similar, and you can take what you know about one of them and apply it to the other. Whereas in the back end, we're talking about totally different programming languages, usually different architectural choices, and often different ways of connecting things to each other. And finally, when it comes to web development, this next leads us to front-end development. So in the front end, like I mentioned, we do work with JavaScript, but we also work with HTML and CSS. So HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language, is the language that defines the structure of what you see on a web page or in a mobile app that's built with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And that's kind of the basic idea of like what defines like a box that you see on a screen or a button or the placement of that box relative to the button. And then we have CSS, which is Cascading Style Sheets, which is what defines the way those things look. So HTML defines the position and CSS defines the way they are styled or the way they look. So if you have like a box and there's a button inside of that box, CSS can say, oh yeah, that button should be in the center of that box or off to the left. And that button should be green or it should be red. And the style of the text and the font and all of that fun stuff. Now in front-end development, these three languages, Hypertext Markup Language, Cascading Style Sheets, and JavaScript, are all going to be used for every single major front-end development platform or framework. So of those, we have three major frameworks too that are very popular, which are Angular, React, and Vue. And you may have heard of these already. They do basically the same thing, but they do it in slightly different ways. There's definitely people who will tell you that one of them is better than another one, or why you should use one instead of the other one. Ultimately, though, it really depends again on your job market, which one I would say you should learn. Now, personally, I'm partial to Angular mainly because I know it the best, but also because it has everything out of the box that you need. Whereas with React, you kind of have to take some other stuff and throw it in there with React to make it work, which can be confusing when you're new to this because you have to pick between similar options and decide how you want to set your React app up and which tools you want to use, how to structure the code, whereas Angular is very explicit about how you should do things, and so it's a little easier to learn as a first framework. Angular also uses TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript. It's basically JavaScript, but set up like a static language to make it more maintainable. So I love that about Angular because I like the fact that it's a static language. Even though it's not technically a static language, it kind of turns JavaScript mostly static, which is really nice. It makes it a little easier to work with when you're maintaining a project for a long period of time. But again, React and Vue are also great choices, and don't let my bias change the way that you look at those three options. I definitely would say that if everybody in your area is hiring for React or Vue, then it wouldn't make much sense for you to learn Angular. So at the end of the day, it's much more important to look at your job market and which one is the most relevant. So this is kind of the basic makeup of web development and mobile development. Now, one change to front end for mobile development is that a lot of mobile development is built with Java in the front end for Android, or different languages for iOS, depending on what you're trying to do. And so ultimately, when you get into mobile development, there is that potential for an additional layer, but these major frameworks, Angular, React, and Vue, have also had tools created so that you can use Angular, React, and Vue to build front-end applications on a mobile device. Now, the one major exception I would say to that is if you were to get into games on a mobile device. At that point, I would say you probably don't want to go with JavaScript, Angular, React, Vue. You probably want to go with Java at that point so that you can build a game and functionally kind of structure that. And the main reason I say Java and not whatever the latest is for iOS is because when you get into iOS development, you need to have a Mac, you need to have an iPhone, you need physical hardware that's specific to Apple, or they basically won't let you do anything with it. So if you built like a really powerful iOS application and you're emulating it on your computer or something, which technically would also be illegal because of the way they have their software set up, but assume you were able to do all of that, you couldn't get that onto the App Store until you buy a Mac. You're not allowed to. So ultimately, it's just too expensive, in my opinion, for a beginner to get into unless you already own a bunch of Apple hardware, in which case maybe that would be a reasonable choice for you. Now finally, let's talk about a couple of odds and ends here. So aside from web development and mobile development, we also have machine learning that we talked about. Now for machine learning and artificial intelligence, we basically would use Python. Now there are other languages, and really almost every other language has some kind of machine learning and AI tools at this point, but Python has been kind of a leader in this space. They have a lot of integrations, and even though they aren't always the most efficient, sometimes they are, but even though they aren't always the most efficient choice in the end for a resulting solution, they're often the quickest to develop, and there's a lot of Python developers, so it's a lot easier for a company to get a bunch of Python developers who can work together than to kind of specify some other programming language to build machine learning solutions with. Now, we also talked a little bit about DevOps, which could also be called cloud engineering. And when it comes to DevOps, it's really not so much about the programming language at all. It's much more about the cloud platform's tool sets. So at this point, I again would go back to job research. So looking at jobs in your area, finding out if more jobs are looking for AWS developers and certificates, or Azure or Google Cloud Platform, because at the end of the day, that is going to be what makes it easier for you to find a job, picking the platform that is popular in jobs near you. Now, I will also add that a lot of DevOps engineers do use Python for some form of scripting to make their lives easier, to automate things, to kind of write smaller scripts. Now with this situation, you don't need to know very much about a bunch of different Python libraries and stuff like that. Like you could learn totally different stuff and get into machine learning with Python compared to what you would use when you're working with DevOps with Python. So it's definitely like a different flavor. You would be focused on a lot of different things, even though you'd still be writing Python code if you were doing DevOps. And also, JavaScript and Node can also be used to write those kind of automation scripts. And in those situations, it's not about building an actual program or application. It's just about a script that does a specific thing. Now, we also talked a little bit about video games, and ultimately the biggest choice for video game developers is C++, because C++ is kind of at the base of most game development engines. But you could also technically build video games with just about every language, because it's one of the things that most languages will add to what you can do with them, just to try and get people to learn that language and then hopefully go into other stuff to add support for their language. But at the end of the day, C++ has long been the top choice for video game developers, and I think that it still will be for a very long time. Now, the secondary option here is, of course, Java, if you're talking about mobile games. So games that are like apps on your phone, you'd probably want to use Java, especially for Android. And then again, when you get into Apple stuff, it changes all the time. Java does technically work on iOS for some things. Other things, Objective-C was really popular for a long time. I think lately Swift has been the most popular one, but I don't know how long that's going to last either. So really it's more about whatever the latest thing is that iOS wants you to use, because at the end of the day, Apple is going to be in control of how that stuff works. So I would look into what Apple wants you to use if you wanted to get into Apple development, because that is where you'll need to start. And when we talk about video game stuff, we still do bring SQL into the equation, because SQL is still used to store information about users, users that need to log into your application where the video game is running, information about what your level is or what level you're on, or how much money your character has, or whatever the situation is. All of that stuff still needs to be stored in a SQL database. Alright, so I think that pretty much covers everything, and I hope that this video has been useful to you in helping you to kind of decide where to start and cut through the noise of deciding how to pick a programming language, or just a place to start even if it's not a language, in software development. And I look forward to seeing you in future videos.